You look like you're ready, so...
Yes.
Okay. Father, I'd like to start with your early life a little bit here. You're a Chicago native, are you not?
Yes, I was born on the south side of Chicago, and I graduated from Visitation Elementary School in 1924. I entered Quigley Preparatory Seminary in September of 24, and I graduated from Quigley. It was a 5-year preparatory seminary, and graduated in June of 1929, and mid-September of 1929 I went to the major seminary in Mundelein, Illinois, and the course there is 2 years of philosophy and 4 years of theology. And while I was midway through the seminary, I got hurt playing football, and my knee went out of place, and one of the opposing players was the Dr. Mayo of the century, and we could have sued him for practicing without a license, and he pulled my knee back into place, and I was carried off the field and went to my room, and I was put to bed, and it was October and 31, and October devotions were on at the main chapel, so I had been carried to my room at 4 o'clock, and everybody in the residential hall left for a chapel exercise at 5 o'clock, and then they went to dinner at 6, and about 5 o'clock I was trying to get out of my bed to go to the powder room, and I was holding my leg stiff, and my knee went out of place again. So I was in purgatory for about 3 hours until my comrades returned from dinner, and then they called a doctor from Libertyville, Illinois, and he put a cast on my leg, and he left it on too long, and my brother was an attorney, and he had gone to school with a couple of classmates who were attorneys for the Chicago White Sox. And of course they knew a doctor by the name of Dr. Philip Cruiser on the staff of Mercy Hospital, an eminent bone man, and with the White Sox and athletic team. So I went to Mercy Hospital, and he put weights on my leg, and was released in 2 weeks. I returned to the seminary, and then mid-April was experiencing a lot of distress, and played a return engagement at Mercy Hospital and underwent surgery. And I returned to the seminary and passed the examinations, but I had missed too much time for the term, and I was forced to repeat a year in the seminary, and instead of being ordained in 1935, was ordained in 1936. And the Lord is the greatest playwright in the world. If I had been ordained in 1935, I would have gone into a parish. But I was ordained in 1936, and in 1936, Cardinal Mundelein made a change at Maryville Academy, St. Mary's Training School in Des Plaines, Illinois, that was a home for dependent children between the ages of kindergarten and through high school. And if I had been ordained in 35, I wouldn't have never seen Maryville Academy because that was appointed a year later, 1936. So I stayed there for 5 years, and I taught religion in grammar school and history in high school, and coached grammar school and high school football and basketball. And in the course of my 5 years there, I began to learn that alcoholism is a family sickness. Quite a few of the kids out there, they were half orphans. The mother had died, or maybe she had been was confined to a sanitarium, or and the father in those days would only be getting 5 days vacation, and what would he do 360 days a year? 51 weeks for his children, and he would seek the counsel of a minister or a clergyman, and they would recommend a school such as Maryville. And those days, those institutions under the aegis of the Catholic religion ran pretty much excessively nationalistic. There was an orphanage at Devon and Ridge called Angel Guardian Orphanage for German descent children. That is now a bastion for mentally retarded infants known as Misericordia Home. There was also an orphanage for Polish descent children at Tui in Harlem, and that is now a conglomerate of apartment buildings there. And then there was an orphanage in Lisle, Illinois for Bohemian descent children. There was a school at 49th and Prairie for children who were black, and I was at the so-called Irish orphanage, but it was pretty much embroidered with kids of Irish and Italian complexion. And so I remained there for 5 years, and in 1941 I was transferred to Our Lady of Peace Parish at 79th and Jeffrey, and 6 months later the drums of war began. I was at Comiskey Park. I had gone to confession, and the priest said, for your penance, go and see the Bears play the Cardinals at Comiskey Park. So I was at Comiskey Park, and at halftime an ominous alarm was sounded that the Japs had bombed Pearl Harbor. The next day was December the 8th, a Catholic feast day, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and the war was on, and hundreds of people were at church that morning, and there were couples that maybe 55, 60 years old, and they had children, youths who were ready to abandon the home site fires and enter the armed forces, the Army, Navy, and Marines. And after 5 years at Our Lady of Peace, I was assigned by the Cardinal to the Catholic Charities. And the Catholic Charities is located at Randolph and Desplaines Street. And next door to the Catholic Charities was the Desplaines Street police station. In the basement were the cells, and on the first floor was the police department. On the second floor was a drunk tank. At that time, there was a tremendous descendant upon Skid Row. To me, Skid Row is not a piece of real estate. It's a state of mind. More alcoholics are found in penthouses than in flop houses. Only less than 4% of the public inebriate is found in the Bowery or 5th and Main in L.A. or 4th and Howard in San Francisco, or the Bridge in Buffalo, or Skid Row in Chicago. So after office hours, I would go in and out of the flop houses and visit with the lads and in and out of the bars. There were a lot of shops in those days called slave marts, and the slave marts were employment agencies. And the men recovering and feeling good, they would go to one of these employment agencies, and the minimum wage, I think in those days, was $1.65 an hour. So they would be picked up and in front of the hotels and taken by station wagons to various places of employment, and the men employing them would say, well, you're going to be hungry while you're on the job, so we're bringing a can of Coca-Cola for you, and a sandwich and a piece of fruit. And then when they returned them at 5 o'clock at night, when it was payoff time, they would have deducted from their pay the can of Coca-Cola and the 2 sandwiches. So there was quite a bit of exploitation in those days, and thank God there were flop houses. And if there weren't flop houses, where would these young lads or middle-aged or older lads who were dependent upon alcohol, where would they reside?
Back in those days, Father, how did society look at people who had alcohol problems?
They identified people with alcohol problems with Skid Row. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that they were working with alcoholics or living next door to them or upstairs or downstairs. There was a gentleman by the name of Clem Lane who was the city editor of the Daily News. And Clem Lane, the office, his office, the Daily News building, was just east of the Northwestern Station. Clem Lane resided on the northwest side of Chicago around Touhy and Western. And he would come to his office every day, the Daily News, and walking up and down Madison Street, he saw that it was overpopulated with a lot of lads in the wake of World War II. They had come from the Bible Belt, and there were aliens to alcohol and in the service, and when they had free time, they'd say, well, you're wearing Uncle Sam's uniform, why can't you drink? So some of the lads became dependent upon alcohol, and they didn't want to return to the home firesides and bring disgrace upon Ma and Pa, so they took the lines of least resistance and went where alcoholism was accepted. They found in the Chicago area, Madison Street, and so my hours during the day was to place dependent and retarded children in our institutions. Around that time, Samuel Cardinal Stritch took over the baton in the Archdiocese of Chicago, and he was acquainted with the School for Retarded Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, and St. Coletta School for Jefferson, Wisconsin. One of the more prominent persons in that school was John F. Kennedy's sister. She was a retardate, and that's why the Kennedys were so sensitive to retardation. And these sisters, the Cardinal Stritch invited these Franciscan nuns who operated St. Coletta School for Retardates into the Archdiocese of Chicago, and he was very sensitive to retarded children, so he opened an institution at McCarthy and Wolf Road and called it Coletta School for Retarded Children. And these nuns were from, they had their origin in Bavaria. They had a spiritual director there who was very much ahead of his time and saw retardation as a problem that would blossom and burgeon. And so he convinced these Franciscan sisters to let her in retardation. And so they came and settled in Jefferson, Wisconsin, and opened St. Coletta School. And Rosemary Kennedy was a resident there. Cardinal Stritch invited these nuns into Chicago. He inherited a lot of families here who had retarded children, and he was aware of this institution, so he romanced these nuns, and they came to Chicago and opened the Coletta School for Retarded Children. And the Kennedys at that time purchased the Merchandise Mart. Mm-hmm. And Eunice Kennedy and Pat Kennedy, or rather Jean Kennedy, were working in the Merchandise Mart, and also working in the Merchandise Mart at that time was a young fellow by the name of R. Sergeant Schreiber. He was fresh out of Yale University and applied for a position at the Merchandise Mart and received it and became a manager of the Merchandise Mart. And time marched on, and Cupid aimed an arrow, and it pierced the heart of a Eunice Kennedy. And our Sergeant Shriver and Eunice Kennedy exchanged vows in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and I was fortunate to be invited to the wedding. And the Kennedys became very, talked to the sisters at the St. Francis, the Kennedy School, and talked to Cardinal Stretch, and they erupted with about $750,000. And so the school was no longer Coletta School. It eternalized Joseph P. Kennedy, who was killed over the British Isles in World War II. So it became a home for retarded boys between the ages of 6 and 12 chronologically, and 55 to 75 mentally wise. And my position of the Catholic Charities then embraced to become the intake office for the Kennedy School. So the parents seeking admission to the Kennedy School would come to our office at 126 North Des Plaines, and we would interview them and draw up a study of the domestic situation and the boy's situation, and the boy would be accepted in the Kennedy School, and it was a residential facility. And in those days, the tuition was $65, and some of the persons in those days couldn't afford the $65, so we exacted $1 a day from them, so they would be invested in the child. It would cost at least $1 a day to take a retarded children in the home, and the Catholic Charities had a fund going to supplement the $40 to make the rather the $30 to make $35 to make the $65 possible. So that was one of my duties, to be the intake director. And Clem Lane, the city editor of the Daily News, would make a daily visit to our chapel. And he was a pioneer member of the AA organization, which was founded about 1937 or 38 in Akron, Ohio, by Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson. And I talked to Clem Lane about the overpopulation of young fellows on Madison Street who became heir to the bottle. And we originated an AA meeting in the basement of the Catholic Charities, and I went in and out of the flop houses and had signs made and went into the powder rooms and put them over the urinals. If drinking is your problem, you want to do something about it, there's an AA meeting tonight, and they would read about it, and many of them would come 98 proof or 86 proof to the meeting, and it was a haven for warmth in cold weather, and it was a haven for refreshment, for coffee and fans during the summertime. And quite a few of these young fellows embraced AA, and in those days there weren't any facilities out of state institutions for alcohol-dependent male and female. And one of the places, institutions, was Manteno, Illinois. There was a doctor at Manteno State Institution. I can't recall his name, and he was a superintendent, and I used to bring men out to Manteno, Illinois, and one day I had in the front seat a fellow, an Irishman out of Boston, and 3 other lads in the back seat, and the medical director came across the roadway, and he recognized my car, and he knew me, and he said, "Father, how many winners have you for us today?" And the fellow in the front seat, well, my heavens, here's my friend. And he looked at the front and he says, Patty, we were roommates at the University of Minnesota. And what happened to you? Well, Patty said, I put a straw in a bottle of Old Fitzgerald and I fell in love with it, and I became dependent upon alcohol, and there was an AA meeting at Father Mac's place. So this is the reason why I'm down here to enter a dry establishment. And so the meetings continued, and then the Catholic Charities called some persons in to evaluate the system. And there were two agencies at that time in the mid-50s, one placing children in institutions and one in foster homes. And my superior said to me, would you like to be a pastor in the shadows of University of Chicago, Maroon Field, old Maroon Field. I remember peddling papers there at Stagg Field when I was steaming through grammar school, and at halftime I'd be able to get in and see Alonzo Stagg's team. And so at that time, Clem Lane was making a visit to our chapel, and I knew he was in the AA program, and I asked him about the potential of establishing a AA chapter on West Madison Street. And he came over, and most of the people on the AA way of life in those days were people from the field of ink. They were in the newspaper world and the publishers. I remember doing field work in New York City in about 1947 or 48, and the White Sox came to town and to play the Yankees, and so the White Sox, I got in touch with Frank McMahon, the traveling secretary, a brother-in-law. He was married to Grace Comiskey's sister, and he told me there would be tickets for me at the box office, and I sat in the press box at the Yankee Stadium, and I was sitting next to Warren Brown. Warren Brown was a sports editor of the Hearst papers, the Chicago Herald and Examiner, and I said to Warren, how did you become interested in sports? Well, he said, I majored in journalism at San Francisco University in about 1920 or 21. While I was a senior, I went to Hearst Square, and I said I was interested in a potential position. A young lady said, young man, sit here. A few minutes later, she returned and she led me into the office of William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst said to Warren Brown, young man, do you drink? And Mr. Hearst, I do not drink. He said, young man, if you're telling me the truth, you're going to walk over a lot of fallen bodies, because alcoholism is an occupational hazard in the world of ink. So we made a contact with Clem Lane, and the AA meeting started in 126 North Desplain Street. I was looking for an alcoholic counselors, and I heard of a doctor by the name of Dr. James West. Dr. James West was a surgeon at Little Company Area Hospital, and he was very interested in alcoholism. And I talked to him about potential lead to counselors who had a AA background, and he recommended a gentleman by the name of Jack O'Neill. And Jack O'Neill became the counselor. Jack O'Neill died, and other AA followers took his place. And a little later, Dr. West left and went to California and became residential MD at the Betty Ford Center. And I recall one day he had come, Dr. West, we were on the Governor's Advisory Board in those days under Dick Ogilvy. And he had created a commission, and on that commission there was about 12 men and 6 women. And Dr. West was on that commission, and I was on that commission. And he had come across an article in the Addiction Research Journal emanating in Toronto, Canada, that there was a facility in Toronto, Canada, operated by a fellow by the name of Bill Peterson. And so he shared this article with me, that Bill Peterson, who had been charge of catering for the Hilton Hotel on a national level, living in a Park Avenue apartment, and he became dependent upon alcohol, and he vacated his Park Avenue apartment for a bench in Central Park. He took the geographical cure and wound up in Canada, and he went to Dr. Gordon Bell and talked to him about the potential of erupting with a residential facility for persons dependent upon alcohol. And so Dr. West and myself left one morning at 6 a.m. or 6:30, and we flew to Toronto, and Bill Peterson met us at the airport, and he escorted us to the facility. And I entered, going down the corridor, there was a gentleman sitting behind the desk, and I looked at this gentleman sitting behind the desk. He jumped out of a chair, come out, opened the door, embraced me, said, "Do you remember me?" "Yes, I remember you. You were from West Madison Street." "Well," he says, "I took the geographical cure. I come to Toronto, to Canada, to drink Canada Dry. Thank God I found sobriety and serenity, and I'm here as a counselor." So we returned to Chicago and talked to the commission, the Governor's Commission, and we asked them about coming up with some seed money. They said, "We're in Tap City." I went to the Catholic Charities, and I'd worked there for years. And I asked them for an entry fee, and they said our resources would not help us to found a facility. So I said, well, let God be the quarterback. So at that time, when I came to Madison Street, the place depended on retarded children, and I spent my free time combing the streets. Now, at that time, there were agencies other than the Catholic Charities opened about 1916, and George Cardinal Mundelein was aware of the homeless in those days, and he founded the Holy Cross Mission, spiritual and material shelter, and also punctuating West Madison Street were other facilities. There was a facility, the Dawes Industrial Center. The Dawes Industrial Center, Presbyterian faith, and that was founded by the son of Vice President Dawes. Evanston was the birthplace of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And an only child. His parents pioneered in graduation.
What was, you talked, you were working up to the point about bringing a residential center to Chicago. What would a residential center do for alcoholics that hadn't been done before, Father?
Well, we had gone, Dr. West and myself had gone to Toronto to see this center in Toronto, Canada. And it put us on fire, and we shared this with the members of the Governor's Commission. We asked if they had money, and they said no. We asked the church if they had money for this, and they said no. So the Presbyteria had come down. Charles Dawes was Vice President of the United States. He had a son, and the son was lettering in sociology at Northwestern University. He lettered in humanity, and he spent his free time in those days plumbing the streets. And He went to an early death, and the family used his portion of the inheritance to surface with the Dawes, the Christian Industrial Center dedicated to Dawes. So the Presbyterians were here. There was the Episcopalians came on the street through the aegis of Canon Gibson. David Canon Gibson was the only child. His family owned a studio. They went into eternity, and he used his portion of the inheritance to surface with the cathedral shelter, which is now at Monroe and Ashland under the aegis of the Episcopalian Church. The Catholic Charities had the Holy Cross mission, and these agencies operated with the philosophy of the 3 S's: soup, soap, and salvation. And so they had facilities for the men, and the facilities for the men provided 3 hots and a cot, 3 hot meals and a cot, and so there was a tremendous influx in the Wake of World tour of young fellows who had become dependent upon alcohol in the wake of World War II. And we had talked to Clem Lane, knowing he was a pioneer, AA man, and we started the AA chapter on West Madison Street. And so at that time, Martin Kennelly was the mayor of Chicago, and he created the commission for homeless men. And he was only a one-termer, and then Dick Daley ascended the throne, and he took up the baton, and this condition continued. So there was the Contagious Disease Hospital at 26th in California, and at that time they were aware that we were bringing men and out to Manteno and women into the Chicago State Hospital. So the Chicago Alcoholic Treatment Center came into being under Martin Kennelly, and it was perpetuated under Richard Daley, and they took over the diseases at that time were pretty well banished by the serums that come out, and that building was vacant, so that was the first site of the Chicago Alcoholic Treatment Center.
What did you do differently in that center than they had been doing before?
Well, prior to that, alcoholism was a sin. There were lazy bums. All you had to do was stop. It's as easy as that. But the CATC resorted to the AA philosophy of life. They surfaced with doctors who understood that alcoholism was a sickness, and that perdured for quite some time. And then that operation went into the graveyard. And so at that time, I talked to my superiors about the potential of a facility. So we had given birth to the Chicago Clergy Association for the Homeless, and it consisted of the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, and the Baptist and the Calvinist. And so we opened a facility in a building owned by the Episcopalian Church, and we could only utilize the basement and the first floor, because the second floor, the roof was very vulnerable, could caved in. So we lost that facility. The building was condemned. And then you had a head of Aladdin's lamp in quest of another building. Nobody wanted to take a building which would cater to people who were dependent upon alcohol and or chemicals. So we asked the Lord to turn up his hearing aid and install some new bad Duracell. So our Lord listened to the plea, and we came across this building, and this building is over 100 years old, and nobody writes a script better than the Lord. You know, this building it's over 100 years old. Now, what was it in the first place? In the first place, it was a piano factory. And that was most apropos because the people we were privileged to serve don't operate on 88 keys. They're out of tune. The time marches on, and what did it become then? It became a casket factory. Well, I came down with my mother and father, with the undertaker, in the wake of my mother's death in 1938, and this was a casket factory. And so I came here with the friendly undertaker to select a casket for my mother. And later on here, when we purchased this building, I said, gee, I was here years ago and it was a casket factory. So here is Frank Buck. He became immortal, bringing the dead back to life. So why shouldn't Ingatius carry on and maybe we could bring the people who were mortally wounded with alcoholism. And we founded Haymarket House, and we called it Haymarket House. You wouldn't want to call it a drunk tank. People have lost an awful lot of self. They've taken a shakedown cruise on their own. They sell themselves short. So we call this Haymarket House, and this is in the shadows of a famous corner. In 1886, a group of Germans, immigrants, who were very sensitive to labor, and they called themselves the Knights of Labor. And those days, people were working 12 and 14 and 16 hours a day. It was like a Simon Legree operation. And these fellows were looked upon as radicals. And in 1886, they held a convention or a conference at the corner of Randolph and Desplaines Street, and it looked like Tag Day in Glasgow, I suppose, in the beginning. People wouldn't want to show up at a place like that. The boss will tell them, hey, what are you trying to do? You're trying to rupture your relationship, and you're a G.I. Joe, and if you want to keep your job, well, so the Knights of Labor were militating for an 8-hour day, and it was on a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and on a Sunday afternoon, it started to rain, and the crowd was dispersing, and somebody threw a bomb, and the bomb maimed and killed some of the people, and the maimed were brought to the basement of the Desplaines Street police station. So looking for a doctor on a Sunday afternoon was trying to find a pearl in an oyster. So somebody said, hey, there's a doctor by the name of Dr. John P. Why can't I think of his name? The Stormy Petrel of John B. Murphy. And there was a story of his life. The Stormy Petrel was written by Nancy Reagan's father. And John Murphy was married into high society, the Plamondon family, probably lived around Monroe and Loomis. And so he was called to the scene. He had freshly arrived from Europe, where the wars were fought in Europe, and there wasn't any war. We had the War of 76 and the War of 1812. So he wanted to learn under the experts how to treat gun wounds. So he took a course in Germany, and he arrived, and he locked himself in the Desplaines Street police station. He didn't want to be interrupted by other doctors coming in. Why are you doing it this way, Murphy? And Murphy wanted to do his own way. So then Murphy transferred the people over to Cook County Hospital. He became very famous. I think McKinley was wounded on a train and was brought to Chicago, and the person who administered to him was John B. Murphy. There's a building on Ohio Street right off of Michigan, isn't there? Or Erie Street, the John B. Murphy Memorial. And there was also a hospital at Belmont and Broadway years ago, the John B. Murphy Hospital.
We're talking about the, you got the building here.
Yes.
And let's see, you started out offering residential treatment for alcoholics here. But
Yes.
It's expanded since then. It covers a lot of different areas now.
Oh, yes. I remember the director of the Department of Alcoholism, I can't recall his name now. He left here to go to Emmitsburg, Maryland, to work, and we took this facility over in the wake of my 50th anniversary. Prior to that, I started the McDermott Foundation, and said in a 50th anniversary mass at Holy Name Cathedral, and then had a reception at McCormick Place, and after the mass, and we had about 6,000 or 8,000 people there, and I had started the McDermott Foundation prior to that, and if anybody out of the goodness of their heart wanted to give me something, they did give. They were very generous, and in the wake of that, we had $225,000, and we were looking for a building. And we found this building, and it was for sale for $1,050,000, and we had the down payment $225,000. So at least we had a beachhead, and every 6 months we're supposed to erupt with $225,000 more. You know, the bankers, they're accused of being allergic to prayer, and they probably began to let her sum cum laude in prayer and keep Ignatius McDermott alive. Every 6 months, Ignatius is supposed to surface with $225,000. So I came across a cup one day, and he said, "How are things going?" or something, and I said, "Well, we're about 2 feet ahead of the sheriff, or we're in an oxygen tent, or something of that nature." And he put an article in the paper, and that Father Iggy was hurting, and you know, who writes a better script than the Lord? A lad who I knew in grammar school and used to shoot basketball. I put some basketball nets up in the schoolyard at Our Lady of Peace at 79th and Jeffrey. My brother was an alderman at that time and secured a couple of baskets for me, and through the Chicago park system. And Catholics pay taxes as well as non-Catholics, and there were basketball courts in public schools. Why couldn't we get a couple of outside basketball backboards in a Catholic backyard? So this fella, George Fawcett, used to come over and shoot baskets. So he had read an article in Cup's column that we needed a financial blood transfusion. So he called me, and he had never married, had a sister, and his parents died. He did well on LaSalle Street. So he said he was en route to Florida, and he dropped in to see me and brought quite a few jackets and slacks and shirts. And then he said, well, Father, here's a piece of paper. I saw in the column you were in trouble. And I looked at the piece of paper, and I was ready for Mayo Brothers. The paper was a check for $100,000. So I said, well, the Lord's got that battery going. And so that put us in good shape. They come up with the $125,000 more for the next payment. So the Lord is good, and we put about close to $30 million into this building, and we operate 365 days, 24 hours a day. And the director of the Department of Alcohol and Substance Abuse, in touring this facility one day, I said, "What's your biggest problem?" Well, he said, "The biggest problem is women in the last 3 months of pregnancy dependent upon chemicals or upon crack." Well, how about it? We would like to operate to baptize the facility and taking care of women in the last 3 months of pregnancy dependent upon crack. So we started this facility, and we've had thousands of crack-free babies come into the world because the women are kept clean in the last 3 months of pregnancy. They have to take a drop every time they go in and out, so there's a Paul Revere alertness to the persons, to the men and women we are privileged to serve. So that's how that came into being, where we lettered in taking care of women in the last 3 months of pregnancy.
You've got a wide range of programs here, from residential to outpatient,
and
chemical dependency, alcoholism dependency.
Yeah.
Is there anything else quite like it around?
No, I don't think so. One of the things we're very proud of is our daycare center. Have you been over there?
Not yet. And
it's across the street, and we would like to purchase that building, but the man who owns that building, I read his death notice today, John Kenny, and will certainly be at that funeral service. So we rent a facility across the street. I'd like you to tour that place, and it's for we call it the Holy Innocents, WHOLLY, Holy Innocents. We baptized that, and these are the children who are the offsprings of the women we are privileged to serve. They're in residence here, and during the daytime they're at our daycare center. And also in that building is a hall, and that's where we have our GA Gamblers Anonymous meeting, where we have our Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and our Narcotics Anonymous meeting. Years ago, I read an article in the papers that Gamblers Anonymous were meeting at a place on South Wabash, and the building had been sold, and they were looking for a place, and I called GA and said that we had a facility available, and if they wanted to avail themselves of this facility, they would be, like at Walgreens, most welcome. And they succumbed, and so they meet consistently here at the Gamblers Anonymous, and we have everything here but Nicotine's Anonymous, I guess. So that's about, and we, I suppose the next chapter in their book would be to find if it's, most of the women we are privileged to serve are without male, and on visiting Sunday, the maternal aunts and maternal grandmothers and maternal mothers visit them. As I look in the future, another dream that I would have to have a facility, hopefully along Lake Street, or it's a manufacturing district, and before it becomes overpopulated with more residential facilities, I'd like to have a facility for the women we are privileged to serve, where they could live there during the daytime and bond with their child, their infant, during the nighttime. And McDonald's has been very sensitive to our needs, and we could probably get the women, minus stability and a work record, to work at McDonald's. After 6 months of working there with fidelity to work and to thoroughness on the job, they could get a job any other place. And then we'd get some women bankers, hopefully, to be interested in the facility. I talked to one of them, bankers, to take care of their salaries where they could establish a financial beachhead. And after 6 months, they could move into a neighborhood that would be, there'd be a paucity of pimps and prostitutes and pushers, and to let them come into an environment that would be hale and hearty, which they deserve to be.
There always seems to be one more project that you're looking at, Father. You always seem to have your eyes another block down the road or two.
Well, God is good. To me, I'm, 80 and more, so I'm asking Him, as the AAs would say, one day at a time. With the Lord, yesterday is history and tomorrow's a mystery. So I only ask Him for today, so every day I get out of bed, it's a bonus. So every night I go to bed, I thank Him for that and see if I can squeeze out another day out of Him. And as I said before, the bankers are praying for me, so that's a good thing too. We have to keep that, come up with the payments all the time. So thank God for having allowed me to live this long and to be sensitive to the needs of His hurting humanity.
There's a saying that from St. Vincent de Paul that you like an awful lot. Could you tell me about that?
Yes, I saw the movie of Vincent de Paul many years ago, and I don't know, they give Oscars to a lot of pictures that are as thin as a wafer and as eternal as a White Sox rally. So what? I've lost my thought.
Oh, the saying was, when you no longer burn
with love, others will die of the cold. I went and saw the life of Vincent de Paul in a movie, and that captivated me. That seemed to be the theme song of his life, and so I left that movie with that thing embedded in my mind, and so that became our game plan, that it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness.
One of the things that I've noticed that you were one of the first treatment centers to understand that alcoholism was a disease, and not a moral failing necessarily.
Yeah.
Now they're starting to find out so much, medical science is starting to learn so much about heredity and things like that.
Yes.
How has that influenced your mission and the things you've been doing? You found that it's not necessarily a human failing, it's a sickness.
It's a sickness, yes. And that's why there's so many, Dr. West was a pioneer in the fact that it's a sickness, and also Dr. Bob, the co-founder of AA, he saw it was also a sickness. And then there was a famous nun by the name of Sister Ignatia out of Cleveland, Ohio. And I think Bill Wilson was in her facility in Cleveland, and she rubbed elbows with him, and she became a convert to the fact that alcoholism is a sickness.
When a person comes here with a need, Father, what sort of attitude do you want them to have when they come here?
An attitude, they come here, well, we're always like Walgreens, you're always welcome. And we've had people come in here 300 times. And God doesn't give up on anybody until the undertaker picks up our body. Why should Ignatius give up on anybody? And those baseball world today is seething with starters in a lacuna finishers. So I ask the Lord every day to be a 9-inning pitcher and stick with the people He privileges us to serve. And so we've had people come in here 300 times, and every time they come in here, even though they play a return engagement with Gordon's Gin or Hiram Walker, they leave here with the feeling, well, there's always a chance. And who knows the next time they're going to be the 20-game winner. So over and over again, we are privileged to cater to the same people, but one day, with the grace of God, and most of the people who populate our staff are people who identify with the sickness, so they'll be more patient and more understanding of the persons who knock on our door every day.
When you look around today, and there are all sorts of places like Charter Hospital and a lot of private companies that are doing a lot of this same kind of work. It's being replicated around the country. How do you feel about the fact that with what you've done here, you may have actually built the foundation for a whole new way of looking at this illness?
Yeah, I think we've had quite a few doctors come in. I remember one night as I was walking into to pass of a Northwestern hospital. It was a sub-zero night, and I was going through the side entrance, and a woman I knew real well, a nurse, and I knew her husband, was coming out of that door, and I said to her, how are you hitting them? How are you hitting them? She said, well, I'm in a slump. John had a relapse, her husband. He's in a certain room. So I said, what are you going to do? She said, I'm looking for a cab. I said, that'd be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Why don't you stay here, and I'll go up and visit John. So I went up and visited John and returned to her and drove her home. And here was a woman who's a nurse, and she understood that alcoholism is a sickness, and it took the world a long time to understand that alcoholism is a sickness. And Dr. Bob, one of the co-founders of AA, and Dr. Gordon Bell out of Toronto, Canada, was another pioneer, Dr. James West at the Betty Ford Center. They received a lighted candle and kept the torch glowing. So thank God their disciples have been multiplying and trying to, I'd like to see more seminarians of all faiths come in here. And we haven't had any seminarians come in here as yet. I would love to see them come in here and get a real baptism to caring for the people who are dependent upon alcohol and upon chemicals. What size is jumping to conclusions? The easiest one in the world.
You mentioned, Father, bringing more seminarians into this center. What is the blessing that you get from working with people who have these problems?
Well, I thank God that for how well He took care of me. He may have shortchanged others with a dependency upon alcohol or chemicals, so He didn't. So that made me more sensitive to be very conscious of people who are experiencing a dependency upon alcohol and chemicals. And there are sick people, and ministers and clergymen are to dedicate their lives to people who are not only spiritually and morally sick, but also physically sick.
Pays back many dividends, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. The Lord is never outdone in generosity.
Is there anything else, Father, that I think we've touched on quite a few subjects this morning?
Yeah, thank you for the privilege.